2006 here in Chicago, organizes reading groups, public fora, research, and journalism, focused on the problems and tasks inherited from different generations. The left of the 1920s and 1930s, the old left, the new left, the generation of the 60s and 70s, and then sort of a post-political left of the 80s and 90s. And we do all that in the hopes of asking about emancipatory politics and their potential today. You can learn more about our activities or find a chapter near you by visiting platypus1917.org, or you can email us at platypusvirtual@gmail.com. Here in Chicago, Itsï, do you have the...
So, for those of you who are local, the Chicago chapter reading group is held Sundays in Harbor 135 from 12 to 3 p.m. Coffee breaks are on Wednesdays. The Hutchinson Commons, 4:30 to 5:30. If you're interested, then contact platypus.chicago@gmail.com or message on Facebook at Chicago.
So as part of a very full schedule of events, we're pleased to welcome to the city of Chicago, all the way from Vancouver, Professor Andrew Feenberg. Now, Professor Feenberg recently published a book with Verso that I hold here in my hand, on which he's going to be giving a book talk today. It's available on Verso's website if you'd like to purchase a copy, or, time permitting, you can walk across the street to the seminary co-op. They have copies available. Professor Feenberg is also going to be speaking on our closing plenary this weekend, Saturday night, titled The Legacy of Georg Lukács. So if you have a copy of his book you'd like him to sign, I'm sure we can arrange that. Professor's going to present, he's going to present his book, and we're going to open the floor to Q&A. So if you'd like to begin with your slideshow.
Okay, is this mic working? Can you hear me? Good. Let's see if I can manage the technology. I'm supposed to be an expert. I did. All right. So this is a talk about an important aspect of the book, and I just published in Verso. Is that better? The book is called The Ruthless Critique of Everything Existing, which is a phrase from a letter Marx wrote in 1843 to one of his friends. And it does, I think, give a good sense of what Marcuse was about. He was the ultimate critique, the ultimate critic of capitalism. So I'm going to now present the talk. I'm going to read it, but you'll have slides to help. I hope that helps. And it's divided into several sections. The first section is called Marcuse's Paradoxical Role. Marcuse was the face of the Frankfurt School during the 1960s and 70s. His reputation rose and fell along with the New Left he championed. Today, he is often overlooked in discussions of critical theory. His eclipse led, among other unfortunate consequences, to the disappearance of his critique of science and technology. In fact, he was the only member of the Frankfurt School to pursue a critique of instrumental reason beyond its earliest beginnings in Horkheimer and Adorno's dialectic of enlightenment. This critique is newly relevant now that we face impending environmental catastrophe due to climate change. Thus, the study of Marcuse today is not simply academic, but once again politically significant. In this paper, I will discuss his concept of nature as it relates to his critique of science and technology, and argue that his work contains valuable resources for contemporary struggles. In the post-war period, Marcuse published two books that made him famous, Eros and Civilization and One-Dimensional Man. These books originally appeared as philosophical essays, but the New Left and the counterculture made them bestsellers all over the world. Sales of One-Dimensional Man reached the hundreds of thousands. Imagine that. A philosophy book that becomes a bestseller. It's not happening very often these days. By the late 1960s, Marcuse had become a celebrity. As one of the key theoreticians of the New Left, he was a major figure in the political controversies of the time and spoke at rallies in the United States and Europe. In this role, Marcuse confronted the crisis of Marxism. The Soviet Union had betrayed the socialist promise of liberation. Regulation and new technologies had made capitalism acceptable to the working class of advanced capitalism. The mass media and consumerism seem to have solved what Marx once called the riddle of history. Marcuse accepted these facts, which most Marxists still refuse to credit. The dystopian prospects envisaged in One-Dimensional Man canceled all the old determinist versions of Marxism. The potential for socialism was there in the rich societies created by advanced capitalism, but consciousness was so successfully controlled that few desired revolutionary change. Marcuse emphasized the new role of technology, which no longer acted simply as means of production, but had become an ideological resource of capitalism. Paradoxically, this pessimistic vision evoked resistance and struggle. By 1968, Marcuse's 1964 dystopianism was distinctly out of date, yet the threat of dystopia continued to motivate the New Left, and his books became ever more popular. This was the moment when new forms of resistance emerged: the anti-war movement, the civil rights movement, feminism, environmentalism. They all testified to the limits of the system. And today, the movement to protect the climate continues the struggle in the domain of technology. So this section is called Interpreting Marx's Manuscripts. Nature is once more on the agenda, as it was for Marx in 1844. The economic and philosophical manuscripts were Marx's first significant attempt to develop a theory of capitalism. Marcuse wrote one of the first interpretations of the manuscripts in 1932. I overlooked here the fact that you should know the manuscripts were not published until 1932, and then Marcuse wrote this early essay. His interpretation was deeply influenced by his background in the thought of Husserl and Heidegger. These were his teachers in Germany in the early 1930s. In the manuscripts, Marx rejects the idealistic emphasis on consciousness and argues that human beings are natural sensuous beings. The manuscript's insistence that human beings are natural seems obvious, but Marx claims that human feelings and passions are true ontological affirmations of deity. That's a quote. By this, he seems to mean that human feelings and passions belong in some sense necessarily to the natural objects they implicate. Some element remains here from the idealist notion of the unity of subject and object. So people are not just things in the world like trees and rocks. They are somehow deeply and necessarily implicated in the world that the natural world that they inhabit. Some element remains here, I say, from the idealist notion of the unity of subject and object. Marx alludes to this when he writes, quote, "The sun is an object, a necessary and life-assuring object for the plant, just as the plant is an object for the sun, an expression of the sun's life-giving power and objective essential powers," end quote. The connection between human being and nature is further developed in Marx's concept of objectification, according to which human beings institute their needs and faculties in nature through labor. But the connection is broken by alienation. what makes revolution an ontological necessity. So Marcuse interpreted the manuscripts in terms of contemporary German philosophy, neo-Kantianism, and especially phenomenology. The phenomenologists rejected naturalism and argued that experience cannot be reduced to a subjective overlay on the nature of natural science. Husserl introduced the concept of the Lebenswelt, the life world, by which he meant the essential connection between lived first-person experience with the objects of experience. This is the connection here. The important point is it's lived first-person experience, which is different from what science engages with, which is a kind of third-person experience. Heidegger developed a related concept which he called being in the world. This term Dasein refers to the human subject in its active role, engaged with the meaningful things implicated in its world. This too is a kind of subject-object unity, although no longer based on the idealist concept of consciousness, because it's based on the notion of practical engagement with things. Marcuse found here a connection to Marx's attempt to escape idealism. Marcuse developed an experiential ontology on the basis of a synthesis of Marxism and phenomenology. In one early work, he argues that the objective facts by themselves are incomplete because they leave out the form in which they are, quote, entwined with historical human existence. This concept has to do with the lived experience of social reality. Facts are not merely facts, but need to be understood as they impinge on lived experience. Experience reveals connections that would be missed from an objective standpoint. Marcuse gives the example of a workplace. The experience of those who live it, the workers, reveals aspects hidden to the mere observer, and a fortiori to management. It is the task of philosophy to go beyond the facts to their human and social meaning. Marcuse writes, quote, while the scientific method leads from the immediate experience of things to their mathematical logical structure, philosophical thought leads from the immediate experience of existence to its historical structure, the principle of freedom. The term existence here means, again, this first-person relationship to reality. Note that Marcuse does not claim that one of these two modes of knowledge is superior. He writes, quote, no method can claim a monopoly of cognition, end quote, but only the study of existence is politically relevant. Marcuse interprets the manuscripts as an experiential ontology in terms of concepts such as these. This quasi-phenomenological approach leads to some unusual results, three of which I will mention here. According to Marcuse, nature in the manuscripts is not scientific nature, and Marx's categories are not causal categories, nor is the mere fact that human beings can be counted among the things of nature philosophically significant. Such a common-sense reading of the manuscripts misses the point. Marcuse distinguishes the nature of natural science from what he calls the concept of, quote, nature in the wider sense given to this concept by Marx in the manuscripts and also by Hegel, end quote. By the wider sense of nature, Marcuse means nature insofar as it is implicated in human activity. In one early essay, he attributes this distinction to Lukács, who recognized the difference between the ahistorical nature of physics and the historical nature of the life space of human Dasein. What is significant is the lived relation of the human being to nature. This encompasses the body as it relates to nature through feeling, need, and the senses, binding it to experiential nature. That nature belongs essentially to the being of the human subject. So I don't know if this is getting across, but in Descartes, the cogito is completely independent of nature. Right? Nature is extended substance, the cogito, the mind, consciousness, is pure thought. This idea dies with Heidegger, and in a sense also with Husserl. Instead, the subject is bound up with nature, inextricably bound up. You can't separate it. And Marcuse is arguing that Marx in 1844 is already trying to make this anti-Cartesian move, binding the human subject to nature. Marcuse interprets Marx's concept of species being as access to the universal, that is, to the meaning of objects. There's an echo here of Heidegger's concept of openness to being. Such openness is the specificity of the human being, revealing potentialities that go beyond the immediate state of things. Those potentialities are taken up by labor, through which human faculties are objectified in nature. Through objectification, nature is made to conform to humanity. But note, objectification is not just something human beings do. It is an essential mode in which human beings participate in nature. Quote, the reality of man consists in bringing out all his species' powers in real objects, the positing of a real objective world. Because the objective world now is not the world of science, but the world of lived experience. The reference to objectivity signals the cognitive role of objectification, which discloses the true being of nature. Raw nature, prior to objectification, is incomplete, not yet fully actual in the Hegelian sense of the term. Labor allows natural objects to achieve their true form, to become real objects, revealing aspects that only come to light through human activity. As Marcuse later writes, quote, truth is attributable to nature, not only in a mathematical, but also in an existential sense. The emancipation of man involves recognition of such truth in things, in nature, end quote. Okay, with this background then, in Marcuse's early interpretation of Marx's manuscripts, we can go on to discuss his later critique of science and technology in One-Dimensional Man. So we're skipping a ways here now, from 1844 to 1932, and from 1932 to 1964. Marcuse's interpretation of the manuscripts underlies his later work, including his critique of science and technology. His writings in the 1960s contain 3 different critiques of technology, all of which are still relevant. The first critique argues that technology has become ideology, instituting a new kind of legitimation process, different from the role of religion or bourgeois ideology. It is the actual material world itself that now legitimates the system by prescribing all needs and hopes. Technology frames a way of life in a modern society concerned, above all, with consumption. The individuals seek fulfillment in private possessions and accept their place within a technocratic society they cannot understand and indeed do not need to understand. Where ideological discourse used to fool the masses, now concrete technical achievements do the work of reconciling them to the injustice they suffer, more or less unaware. So that was the thesis of One-Dimensional Man, the one-dimensionality thesis. These injustices and their consequences are now treated as technical problems, which experts can handle far better than the public. Technology is not only the material culture of society, but also a mode of thought. Technical problem solving within the given framework replaces normative political concerns that might lead to fundamental social change. As Habermas explains, talking with Marcuse, where for Marx the relations of production provided a basis for a critique of capitalist relations of production, for Marcuse, modern science and technology provide a continuation of those relations. This, he says, is, quote, what Marcuse conceives of as world historically new. The second critique concerns Max Weber's concept of rationalization and its application to industrial society. Capitalism is a rationalized society in the sense that techniques of calculation and control organize production, distribution, and administration. These rational methods are embodied in management and the management science, which explains how to organize effective collective action. Marcuse argues that Weber's concept of rationalization is uncritical. Rationalization, as Weber understands it, presupposes control from above, a characteristic requirement of capitalism, not rational methods as such. Weber considers, quote, the separation of the workers from the means of production as a technical necessity, end quote. This separation is what requires management from above, but it would not pertain to a socialist system in which workers collectively own the means of production. Weber's rationalization thesis describes how things actually work under capitalism, but it masks the bias of capitalism toward domination. Socialism, conceived as the democratic organization of collective action, is eliminated as irrational at the outset by a conceptual sleight of hand. If you think that the only way to do things is through management from above, why then socialism seems absurd. The bias of rationalization also affects technological design under capitalism. Technologies of control and domination are privileged over technologies that favor democratic engagement by workers. Control from above requires designs that pace work, surveil workers, and control the labor force. The assembly line is an example of such a biased technological design. I've also mentioned Facebook today. The exorbitant role of military technology was particularly salient during the 1960s. Marcuse explained its role under capitalism in writings on the war in Vietnam. The third critique develops these social arguments in a more complex ontological framework. One-dimensional man follows Husserl, claiming that science arises from the life world, from which it draws concepts it refines into instruments of scientific knowledge. Science constructs an object, the world as matter in motion, that is adjusted to mathematical and experimental methods. When everyday consciousness takes that object for reality, experience is limited to those same parameters. Marcuse uses the term one-dimensional to describe the kind of thinking that results from the intrusion of what are properly scientific ideas about the nature of reality into everyday experience. He explains this in terms of his unique synthesis of phenomenology and Marxism. In modern times, physics has become the paradigmatic science which establishes the nature of reality. Physics works with the primary qualities of objects, aspects that can be measured and quantified. It eliminates secondary qualities in order to get at what it can use as facts and data in its work. Marcuse does not contest the cognitive value of science, but he also agrees with Heidegger that these facts and data belong to a technological conception of reality, adjusted to a specific type of instrumental control. He writes, science, by virtue of its own method and concepts, has projected and promoted a universe in which the domination of nature has remained linked to the domination of man. End quote. Capitalism strips the world of its own sources of development, making it available for any purpose that human beings impose upon it. Marcuse explains this by reference to Sartre's concept of a project. The project in Sartre's sense is not a particular plan, rather it is a scene on which plans can be devised and implemented. Capitalism is a civilizational project in this sense and defines a specific life world in which nature is reduced to raw materials to be exploited and dominated. Scientific concepts emerge out of this world and reflect it, as do technological designs. Marcuse writes, quote, when technics becomes the universal form of material production, it circumscribes an entire culture. It projects a historical totality, a world, end quote. World in this passage should be understood in terms of Marcuse's version of the similar phenomenological concept. Lived experience is now entwined with the world created by capitalist technology. What happens when experience is shaped by such a quasi-scientific ontology? Marcuse argues that the potentialities of nature and human beings are included. In his early Hegel book, potentiality is treated as a second dimension of experience, distinct from factual existence. Potentiality in this sense is a familiar concept, relevant to a variety of everyday phenomena. We see nature and other human beings in terms not only of what they are in the moment, not only in terms of what we could measure, but also in terms of what they can become. And this perception is normatively informed. And this is obvious in the case of children. You don't see them simply as something you can measure in the moment, but as something becoming. Becoming, for example, learning new words, learning new skills, and so on. And this is a normative notion of the second dimension is normative because we're looking at the potentialities that will be realized in the full development of the person and the thing. Potentialities belong to a spontaneous teleological metaphysics science rejects. The notion that nature's potentialities are real, that nature is a subject in its own right, could serve as a guide to human action. But when science becomes the dominant understanding of reality, when it forms an implicit ontology of the society, potentialities are increasingly eliminated, not just from science, but from experience as well. They are now considered really subjective, products of our psychology, our background and culture, and as such, they lack normative force. The life world is impoverished by the loss of a robust sense of potentiality. Marcuse's ontological critique does not attribute a particular ideological bias to modern science and technology, but rather argues that their very neutrality with respect to the distinction between mere preferences and objective potentialities ties them to the established powers. If things have no intrinsic potentialities you should respect in working with them, why then whoever has power will tell you what to do with things. Since potentialities can no longer guide human action, the only effective values are those of the dominant powers. That is, the corporations and the government agencies that act for them. The potentialities eliminated from science and experience no longer influence the actions of those powers. The technology they deploy differs from all previous forms because it views the world as a fungible resource rather than as a bearer of potentialities that could be actualized with help from human skill. We see the consequences today in the destruction of the environment. So this section is called The New Science. If science is bound up with capitalism, then socialism would seem to require a different science, a successor science. This was Marx's conclusion in the manuscripts in 1844. This is what Marx said. Industry is the actual historical relationship of nature and therefore of natural science to man. And quote, understood in terms of the concept of objectification, as positing human faculties and needs in nature, modern science can no longer ignore history. Quote, in consequence, natural science will lose its abstracting material, or rather its idealistic tendency, and will become the basis of human science, as it has already become, albeit in a strange form, the basis of actual human life, end quote. So we've got Marx in 1844 saying we need a new science. Marcuse follows up this astonishing claim on the basis of his own idiosyncratic phenomenology. Husserl and Heidegger seek the ontological ground of modernity in the scientific worldview. While Marcuse takes up their critique, he proposes a more concrete historical perspective based on the ethical character of modes of production. He differs from Husserl and Heidegger in arguing that the privilege of instrumental control has a social origin, the capitalist life world. This in turn suggests the possibility of ontological transformation through political change. Socialism as an ethical alternative to capitalism would have an original ontology. With this, the ontological argument is brought down to earth where it converges with Marx's early demand for a new science. Marcuse argues that under socialism, a new science will reflect a changed life world. It will valorize the secondary qualities, including potentialities. Domination is not the only form of instrumental action. Cultivation and artistic creation are alternative forms that will be privileged in a socialist society. In the manuscripts, Marx writes that unlike animals bound by need, quote, man constructs also in accordance with the laws of beauty, end quote. It's a remarkable phrase. Marcuse repeats this phrase and argues that through art, nature can be freely reimagined, revealing life-affirming potentialities. These potentialities are not merely subjective, but reflect growth and natural flourishing. Our experience of norms such as beauty and compassion, and our sense that nature is violated through destructive acts, belongs to a different, non-scientific form of objectivity. It's not just a personal preference. It reflects the nature of reality as it appears in the life world. If art and science could merge, then science would no longer be confined to the one-dimensional world of primary qualities, but could incorporate the sensuous secondary qualities. Then, Marcuse writes, the scientist, quote, would be guided in his research by the emancipated sensuous needs for the protection and amelioration of life. If the satisfaction of these needs, instead of being a mere byproduct of science, would become the rationale of science, it may well lead to a different conceptual foundation of the natural and human sciences, end quote. Now, unfortunately, this is my conclusion anyway, it is not easy to make sense of this notion. Marcuse understands that there can be no modern society without modern science, and he therefore rejects regression to a qualitative science like that of Aristotle. The new science will continue to employ quantitative methods based on precise measurement and empirical facts, while also incorporating potentialities into its structure. But there is no way for a formal science such as physics or chemistry to incorporate the secondary qualities from which it is abstracted. Modern science is based on equations, unlike earlier sciences based on generalizations and analogies. Equations have no room for concrete experience. Consider a simple equation, such as distance equals velocity times time. The distance traveled is a function of the speed and time of travel. Nothing concrete enters into such a scientific formula. It can only specify the variables relevant to the equation. For example, a measured distance between point A and B. That distance cannot include the aesthetic qualities of the houses and trees encountered along the way. The formula repels such concrete qualities and sticks rigorously to its abstraction. Concrete data cannot be incorporated into an equation, but equations are what modern science is all about. Marcuse wants a different ontology to emerge with a different social world, but it is difficult to see how that can happen so long as natural science is treated as the ontological foundation of modernity. Why would Marcuse have made this assumption? Two reasons occur to me. Since Descartes and Kant, science has provided the model of pure reason. It was only a matter of time before the rationalization of society revealed the dark side of that model. The conflation of modern reason with science and the theories of Husserl and Heidegger continues to influence Marcuse in one-dimensional man. The social context also suggests an explanation. In the early 1960s, science and technology were idealized in the United States to an unusual degree. Remember, we were going to go to the moon. Yeah, we went. For what it's worth. Everything seemed to depend on science, confirming the arguments and fears of Husserl and Heidegger. Only in the late 1970s does the environmental movement gain broad public impact. Marcuse argued that the struggle for nature belonged to the struggle against capitalism and did not have to await the achievement of socialism. This new approach, based on environmentalism, has implications for Marcuse's critique of science and technology. but he did not go back and revise his earlier theories in response. Had he done so, he might have developed a theory of the politics of technology. Despite problems with his notion of a successor in natural science, he introduced several useful concepts that can be applied to environmentalism and other forms of struggle over technology. True, Marcuse did not anticipate this application, which I made, but I think he would have approved. That's my guess anyway, as someone who's studied with him and knew it well. In the remainder of this paper, I will offer some comments on this alternative. One-dimensional man proposes a concept of translation, derived from the French philosopher of technology Gilbert Simondon. The objects of science and the designs of technology can be said to translate concepts and demands elaborated in the life world. In this way, secondary qualities can appear within the sciences in a form compatible with their formal structure. Marcuse writes, quote, "The historical achievement of science and technology has rendered possible the translation of values into technical tasks, the materialization of values. Consequently, what is at stake is the redefinition of values in technical terms as elements in the technological process. The new ends, as technical ends, would then operate in the project and in the construction of the machinery, and not only in its utilization," end quote. The sort of thing he's thinking of is, for example, the seatbelt in the car. The seatbelt translates a concern for survival in the event of an accident into the terms that you can operate in an engineering context. This is objectification by another name applied specifically to modern technology and offering a plausible path to a theory of technological change. On these terms, technology can incorporate values and potentialities. The seatbelt incorporates the value of human life. It is less clear how the concept of translation applies to science. However, Marcuse's concept of object construction explains his intention. The objects of science were traditionally viewed as natural kinds. Marcuse argues that these objects are historically contingent. They are not out there like the bones of the dinosaur waiting to be discovered, but must be constructed imaginatively. When the life world changes, the objects of science change as well. So, a new section, the politics of technology. I have pursued the concepts of successor science, translation, and object construction in my work on technology. Applied to the technical disciplines that actually organize social life, these concepts are the basis of the theory of technical politics. Technical disciplines are far more permeable to social demands than is natural science, and their objects are far more ambiguous. Marcuse treats only one of these disciplines, management science, which is socially constructed in accordance with capitalist assumptions. He shows that what we call management is a conceptual object belonging to a certain history. That object would be conceived differently in a society based on cooperation rather than control from above. Marcuse's critique of management can be extended to all the technical disciplines that structure our world. Food science that determines our diet, engineering that builds roads and automobiles, medicine that takes care of our physical health, interior architecture which constructs the spaces in which we live, computer science which designs the internet, and so on. These disciplines use scientific methods in a variety of specific social contexts. Their objects, like management, are socially constructed in accordance with the demands of social actors. This universal technification involves a mediation Marcuse failed to theorize, except in the case of management. Scientific methods are as indifferent to potentiality as he argued, but those methods only enter the social world through the translation of potentialities in the object constructions of the disciplines. Those object constructions vary widely, depending on the politics of design, with a correspondingly wide range of social consequences. With the mediation of the concept of object construction, we can build on Marcuse's experiential ontology to explore the politics of the disciplines and the technologies they ground. So again, the seatbelt is certainly designed according to quantitative measures. Facts are all that matter, and so on. And yet, at the same time, it translates the value of human life. So it's an object constructed with that in view. Okay, so this politics takes place against the background of the capitalist heritage. We already have disciplines and technologies that materialize the values of capitalism. And these values are contested in terms of the life-work experiences of ordinary people caught up in the failures of technology. Since the 1970s, political struggles have emerged around nuclear issues, medicine, the environment, and the internet. For example, the feminist movement resisted traditional childbirth procedures and demanded changes in obstetrics. Pregnancy was no longer to be a disease, but became a life experience. The movement of gay people around AIDS resisted the established methods of experimental medicine in the 1980s. Experimental subjects were no longer just objects of science, but also became collaborators. Various environmental movements addressed concerns about nuclear power, air and water pollution, toxic waste dumps, and eventually, of course, the biggest of them all, climate change. In each case, a natural or technical phenomenon was redefined in terms of its wider connection to human life, and this in turn led to scientific technical change. Such controversies were rare in the early 1960s when Marcuse developed his theory, but we are now used to social movements altering and changing the many technical disciplines that actually determine social life. Struggles impose new potentialities on the disciplines, the objects of those disciplines, and the designs of the technologies they support. Reform takes place not through changes in the general ontology of physical nature, but in the regional ontologies of the disciplines as the social world changes around them. Technical politics crosses the gap between the life world and the technical disciplines in both directions. A two-way process of communication between the life world and science grants meaning to experience and changes the object of the science and the design of technology. In the case of climate change, for example, we understand what is happening as the result of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Our conception of the climate is influenced by science, but science is also influenced by pressures from the life world to mitigate these effects. In both cases, the object climate has been transformed. For us, it has taken on properties known to science, which of course, say in the Middle Ages, nobody knew about, while also continuing to concern us as a future environment containing or destroying potentialities favorable to human life, depending on our actions. For science, the climate is no longer simply an object of observation and prediction, but has become a manipulable object of technical control. Struggles over science and technology have gradually reconfigured the public sphere. The objects of the technical disciplines are altered by life-world concerns and public protest based on those concerns. These successor technical disciplines are not as radically different as Marcuse's imagined new natural science, but they are different enough to improve the quality of life in our technified society. And most importantly, the emergence of these political struggles promises to keep open the future, which we now know depends on science and technology. This is an enormous change Marcuse could not have anticipated, although it is consistent with his emphasis on the role of science and technology in society. There are dangers in this new situation, as the anti-vax movement demonstrates, but public involvement in the last 75 years has brought huge beneficial changes in fields such as medicine and the environment. These changes are not as visible as the anti-vax movement because the consequences of successful struggles come to be seen as routine scientific achievements. Today, no one doubts that clean air is desirable, but not so long ago, automobile manufacturers were busy spending millions of dollars lobbying governments to block expensive and unnecessary pollution controls. can't get the same results with the anti-vax movement because it cannot be translated into a scientific principle of some sort. It's just there as an opinion. The notion that there is interaction between the historically changing life world and the sciences is fundamental to Marcuse's thought, but it has now become a practical reality as well. The ontology underlying our sense of reality in modern capitalist society is inherently unstable, liable to fractures and recoveries at any time. The life world under capitalism has retained a sense of potentiality to a greater degree than Marcuse believed likely or possible, motivating struggles to preserve and protect human beings and nature. Where this will lead, we do not know. Will struggles over science and technology culminate in socialism? Whether, as Marcuse supposed, the realization of the potentialities of nature is incompatible with capitalism, only time will tell. He writes, and this is, I think, in 1979, shortly before his death, to drive ecology to the point where it is no longer containable within the capitalist framework means first extending the drive within the capitalist framework, end quote. Insofar as the environmental movement and the environmental sciences function in capitalist society, they are necessarily ambiguous. Even the most radical movements cannot escape this fate. Marcuse writes, quote, objective ambivalence characterizes every movement of the radical opposition, an ambivalence which reflects at one and the same time the power of the establishment over the whole and the limits of that power, end quote. In our contemporary context, Marcuse's thought provokes a new look at Marxism, science, and technology. The concept of nature is central to Marx's manuscripts, and long sections of Capital concern technology and its harms and potentials. But these aspects of his work are overlooked, especially, it seems, by contemporary critical theory. Today, it is obvious that technology is involved in the struggle for nature and the transformation of society. But technology has now spread so widely over the whole surface of society that it is no longer largely confined to factories as it was for Marx. Thus, the demand for technological change is to some extent independent of labor, as Marx understood it. Marcuse's theory illuminates the many resulting struggles over science and technology. So that's the end, and that's the cover of the book. I hope that this was understandable. I see. Better tell them that because their hands are up already.
Okay, so in the interest of time, because we should be wrapping up by 5, I'm going to forego some of the questions I had. I just want to ask one very brief one, and then I know Itsï, you have something you'd like to ask, and then we'll turn it over to Q&A. So, Professor Feenberg, there's a question I'd like to ask, because in your book, multiple times you talk about some of the parallels between the generation that looked to Marcuse for guidance in the 60s and 70s, and some of the parallels of the contemporary movements today. I think you even talked about how some of the demands then parallel demands today, that that generation of the new left really left its mark on politics, and some of the horizons are still the same. I wondered if you would maybe reflect on that sort of the repetition, or what's continued that you see today.
Let's see. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Well, Marcuse's generation was very enthusiastic about the Spanish Civil War, right? In fact, my mother met my father seeking funds for Spanish Civil War refugees. That was, the Spanish Civil War was the left-wing part of it was largely organized by the Communist Party, to some extent by Trotskyist parties and anarchist groups. And all of this pretty much disappears by 1965. Marcuse is writing in a time when the forms of militancy that characterized the left in an earlier era had died, at least in the United States, not in France or Italy, but in the United States. And he took the United States as the most advanced capitalist country as kind of the paradigm case for what the future would hold. And when he wrote One Dimensional Man in 1964, there was almost no left in the US. But by 1968, there was a big left because of the war in Vietnam, because of the civil rights movement, because of feminism, environmentalism. All these movements emerged, and they occupied the space that the communist parties had occupied in an earlier period. And when you look at the left today, it is no different. It is simply still occupying that space where there once was a Leninist-based Communist Party movement, which no longer has any significance in our society today. It's simply not. I mean, it doesn't. I mean, there are people who still are communists and Leninists and so on, but they don't have the hegemony on the left that they had, say, in 1936. So, in my view, Marcuse argued that the new left, even though it died in the late 1970s, would shape the left in the future. And I think he was correct. We still see, we don't have an original left. What we have is a repeat or a revision of forms of leftism that emerged in the 1960s and 70s. And so that I think does also help to explain the relevance of Marcuse today.
Thank you, Professor Feenberg. My question might sound a bit too simple, but I guess why Marcuse and not Adorno or Horkheimer writing other than
Okay, yeah, that's a good question. I remember I spoke to the Platypus Society many years ago, and that's exactly the question somebody asked me. I gave this talk on Marcuse, and they said, yeah, but why not Adorno? I think the answer, of course, Adorno is very interesting and important, and there are many commonalities between Marcuse and Adorno because they both belonged to the Frankfurt School. They had similar experiences, educational experiences. They worked with Horkheimer, who sort of set the program for the Frankfurt School in his famous talk on critical theory. So it's not surprising that they have many commonalities. However, there is a difference. Marcuse was much more explicitly involved with phenomenology than Adorno. And this, you can see this in his texts, and this has a consequence. He was able to understand what was happening in the New Left in a way that Adorno could not. Adorno had a bad experience with the New Left. His students didn't like him very much. They made fun of him. There was the famous Busen axiom, where
a lot of Germans in the audience, so. I can talk.
I think if the same thing had happened to Marcuse, he would have said, "Come closer, dearies." He was more. He had a more sensuous idea. But Adorno said the New Left is just a bunch of narcissists engaged in pseudo-activism. Marcuse saw that what was happening was much more profound. It was a rejection of the rat race, of the capitalist system as a form of culture. He saw that there were important things happening here, that the left was being renewed, even though, of course, he also knew that there were lots of silly people involved, doing silly things, and even worse things. But the mainstream of the movement, the large impact that it had culturally, he saw as a renewal of the left. And this is something you cannot get in Adorno, sorry. He's interesting and worth studying, but he will not inspire you in making a social movement today, whereas Marcuse can.
We have lots of questions. There's no perfect way to do this.
Yeah, I've got plenty of platypus members who are going to ask questions, but if anyone who's not a platypus member and would prioritize you, I can see your reaction. That's it. Oh, no. Sorry. Yeah, I'll ask you as well. So, yeah, trying to keep your questions short and to the point, because it's half an hour and maybe 7 or 8 questions, so please, then Laura.
I actually just want to follow up that a little bit, but from the emphasis of your lecture on technology. And I was thinking particularly of the relationship, not by Marcuse over Benjamin in this case, but about the relationship. You know, infamous work of art essay, and Benjamin describing a particular ambivalent relationship to technology. And you know, it might be, like, I'm a philosophy student, but it seemed to me that in what you presented, Marcuse's understanding of technology, there's still some kind of agency given to technology, and an element that seemed to be missing, but maybe I missed it myself, of the question of, like, technology doesn't act on its own. Right now we have the moment of AI. 20 years ago was the internet. You know, 150 years ago was electricity. 500 years ago was Gutenberg. And these are phenomena of the creations of humanity. And I wondered, and I wanted to hear more about, right, Marcuse's relationship. What did you see be Marcuse's relationship to particularly this more ambivalent relationship that Benjamin articulates towards technology? If there was any of this ambivalent relationship to technology in Marcuse's own work. As you presented.
Yeah, I think Marcuse didn't use exactly the terms that we would use today now that we've had 30 years of science and technology studies and Bruno Latour to inform us. But we can easily translate his notion of translation into the concept of ambivalence. The technologies are not, in Marcuse's view, there is no determinism of technology. Technologies are part of the life world, and their design and organization depends on social actors. So, today we think of this much more in much simpler terms than he was able to work out at that time. But I mean, clearly, like, the city can have a transportation system based on cars, based on bicycles, based on buses, and these are alternatives, and the alternatives change the nature of the city. They determine the design of the urban space. And this is something that can be decided by public policy or by capitalist interests or by different cultural needs and determinations. So this is what translation is about. So technology is definitely ambivalent in the sense, I think, that you mean in Marcuse's work, because of this concept of translation, what he calls materialization of values, that affects the design of technology, not just its usage, but its design.
Thanks, Professor Feenberg, for the talk. I wanted to ask about something you said about the subject-object distinction in Marx, as described by Marcuse. So I forget if you said it or if this was Marcuse's understanding of Heidegger that science, a human subject interacting actively with the world. And so there's this kind of collapse of subject-object. That would be Marcuse's, I'm assuming, understanding of that collapse. And I understood you as saying that a similar collapse is happening in the 1844 manuscripts, or that it had been like that through all of Marx's writing up until that point, perhaps. What I'm asking is, it seems like that didn't stay like that in Marx's writing, and I was expecting you to mark the point in which Marx stopped doing that, and what Marcuse thought about that, and what you think about that. Like, why did Marx start thinking in this Unitarian way? It's probably the wrong word. And then when and why did he stop, and what did Marcuse think about that?
Well, this is a complicated question because it depends on how you understand Marx's later work, and there's a lot of conflict over how to understand it. Was he a naturalist of some sort? Did he, you know, the environmental Marxists like John Bellamy Foster argue that the concept of ecological rift in Marx's later work signifies a return to or another way of binding the human being to nature. And I would tend to agree with that. I think that Marx is still trying to figure out how the human being and nature are connected in some fundamental ontological way. Not just that human beings happen to be things in the world like other things, but that there's a more intimate relationship. And this relationship, but you know, it's unclear what he really thinks this relationship consists in. Is it simply a causal interaction, or does it go deeper to the very structure of the human being and of nature? I don't think that he believes any longer that nature becomes a real object only when human beings have objectified themselves in it. That I think he would have regarded as an idealistic deviation from modern scientific worldview. But there's still something going on with the later Marx that makes him amenable to an ecological reading today. I did not get into that, though. I mean, it was enough that I did.
I think you talked about this a little, but I was just wondering if I could ask more directly, what, in your view, is like the significance, the importance, the relevance of the concept of species being in critical theory and in Marxism generally?
Okay, well, that's an interesting one. If you look at what Marx actually said in the 1844 manuscripts, it's kind of ambiguous. I think he was thinking about the fact that human beings achieve their full development only in community, through language, through culture, through labor with others. Something like that seems to be important. But he also mentions something about, in that little short passage where he talks about species being, he mentions something about knowing the universal. And this is what Marcuse picked up. The key point for Marcuse in his 1932 text, and it also shows up in the 60s in a text he wrote for his inauguration at UCSD in La Jolla in the 60s. It's the idea that what's special about human beings is that they know the universal. In other words, they can discover the meanings of things. And those meanings include not just the way the thing is in its given form, but also its potentialities. And once you view species being, you know, species is the term that you can use to talk about the generality of things. The species is the universal character. Like rabbits have a species. That's their universal characteristic. So Marcuse picked up on that, and he saw it as the key point to emphasize in his 1932 text. So species being then is essentially reason, right? Reason in a very broad sense. Reason as the capacity to know the meanings of things.
Thank you for your talk. You were mentioning Marcuse's synthesis between phenomenology and Marxism. And if that's true, then I would say that certainly differentiates Marcuse and Marcuse from his colleagues Adorno and Wagner. Because Adorno and Horkheimer, I think, clearly recognized the dissolution of the subject-object dialectic as they found it within Marxism, and Marxism found it within critical philosophy, especially German idealism. And Adorno and Horkheimer recognized, I would say, the dissolution of this dialectic into what can be maybe called phenomenology or fundamental ontology on one side, and on the other side, logic positivism. I mean, there is this moment at the end of the 20s and early 30s when Heidegger's Meaning and Time is published, and at the same time, Rudolf Carnap, like the famous member of the Viennese Circle, publishes a text called The Elimination of Metaphysics Through the Logical Analysis of Language. So you have these two, so to speak, polar opposites that I would say Adorno and Horkheimer recognizes a crisis of philosophy. So my question is then, would you say that Marcuse having the synthesis of phenomenology and Marxism is the reason why he has such a different judgment of the student movement in the 60s?
Yes, I think your question is correct. Yes, it is the fact that he was able to see, to understand the function of the life world, and to see that in the student movement, a new life world, which he called an aesthetische Lebenswelt, was emerging. This is what made him able to appreciate the new left, whereas Horkheimer and Adorno could not. But I think that it's the other part of your question, I think, is a lot more complicated and really goes way beyond what I could possibly do now. I'm not so sure that the subject-object distinction dissolves in the other Frankfurt School people. We could talk about that later.
Professor Feenberg, thank you very much. Just first, a brief anecdote. A couple of years ago at the Platypus Convention, we heard from a man called Mitchell Cohen, who was a student radical in Chicago in the 60s, who told us that as some kind of stunt, he and his comrades bought copies of One Dimensional Man and tied them to bricks and threw these bricks through the windows of downtown buildings. So I don't mean to deflate the sales figures that you quote, but it's possible that some of those copies were used for other activities and not read. I'd like to ask a serious question on top of that. I think you convincingly narrated a shift in Marcuse from, and I'm glad you're going to be talking to us about Lukács tomorrow night, from a view of capitalism as a totality to this idea of, as you put it, not transforming the totality, but developing different things within it. And that there was a block for him to going back and revising the groundwork theory of capitalism that would have to underlie such a theory. And such a theory is not something very new, but something quite old, with, let's say, Edward Bernstein and the idea that socialism is gradually developing within capitalism. And you identified that from Marcuse's view of technology and in capitalism in totality, management was a very important feature. And as you aptly put it, if you're only interested in top-down management of society, then who cares about socialism? So I wanted to ask really, what's the connection between that idea of management that comes from Marcuse's kind of theory of capitalism and totality, and these new changes that you see being generated by the New Left? Because it seems to me that what they generate are new ways of top-down management. And they offer new modes of that kind of and that the areas we're interested in, especially environmentalism, tends to eliminate the utopian dimension of even the Heideggerianism in Marcuse's thought, and implement a kind of management which Marcuse may have been very critical of.
Well, Marcuse, I mean, you have to understand what you're talking about. I mean, look, the working class in the 19th century wanted better working conditions, shorter hours. That didn't change the nature of management, it changed the nature of the working conditions. It changed the object, labor. Was that a significant action? Well, as Marcuse writes, anything you do under capitalism is ambivalent. Because it on the one hand, it strengthens capitalism by solving some of its problems. On the other hand, it makes it possible for people to live and to live better. And that, in turn, opens up doors, right? Possible hope for more fundamental change. So the question for us is not whether we can jump to utopia somehow. I don't think we can. This is not the moment. This is not what Lukács called the actuality of the revolution. Far from it. So what do we need? We need a movement that accepts the ambivalence that is necessarily a part of any action under capitalism short of revolution, but moves us in a good direction and keeps open the hope that the future can be a different future. Now, I don't think Marcuse ever gave up the idea that there could at some point be a socialist revolution, but he died in 1979. I think Reagan was still president. This was not the moment when you would expect a socialist revolution to burst out. So the question is, how do you live authentically and with a social conscience, right, in this dark period? And I think today we have the same problems, that we need a way of forming a movement, even if it can't be a socialist revolutionary movement. We need a way of forming a movement that alters the framework of capitalism in significant ways. So I guess I would not really, I don't think it's about Bernstein. Bernstein's idea was that there wouldn't be a socialist revolution. You just vote the socialists in at some point, and that would be the end of it. Whereas I don't think Marcuse believed that the democratic process was capable of achieving a socialist revolution. I think he really did think in terms of vast social movements that might someday appear in the distant future, but which were certainly not on the agenda during his lifetime.
Thank you. Just a few more questions, so we can get through them all if we do about 3 minutes apiece. So very quickly.
Hi, Professor Feenberg. Thank you for your talk. I have 2 questions. I'll try to keep them brief. The first is about this idea of kind of a broader definition of nature, broader than Heideggerian ontological understanding of it. And I thought what you said was interesting, but it also made me think that, well, wouldn't Rousseau, for example, assumed this sort of definition of nature? So isn't that necessary in order to say, as he does in the second book of On the Social Contract, that in order to build a constitution, a man must think himself capable of giving man a new nature? Right, that must be possible. Or couldn't we see this as related to ideas from Locke or even political economy, right? The physiocrats all the way through to the utopian socialists. And I think it does suggest the need for something like a successor science, which is taken up by people like Francois. And so I guess I'm wondering how Charles Fourier, People like Marcuse and Marx are different from this, and also why it might be that one needed to kind of, I don't know, reinstate this broader understanding of nature in the 20th century, why that needed to be recovered, and how it might be different than it would have been in the past. And then my other question has to do with this very interesting discussion of Adorno and Marcuse that many people have brought up. A lot of this discussion is reminding me of an interview that I and another person at Platypus did with Angela Davis, I guess now 2 years ago, where we asked her about Marcuse and Adorno because of something she'd written. And she said, well, Adorno understood that the revolution had failed in the past and thought that we just need to think about that, while Marcuse understood that there's new things happening now. And that's why Marcuse was closer to the student movement. At the same time, the way that you talk about the student movements of the 60s is replacing the kind of ecological niche of communism. Makes me think that maybe Marcuse isn't so far away from something like Adorno's idea. And in One-Dimensional Man, I've always been struck by the argument that Marcuse has about the seeming impossibility of revolution. The one-dimensional society is a society in which revolution is neither possible nor perhaps desirable. And some of the political context of that, it seems to me, beyond the realities of the management of the capitalist state, would also be the fact that there was a massive communist movement claiming that you didn't need the revolution internationally and that it wasn't possible. There were people like, I guess this is a bit later, but Ralph Miliband saying you don't need a revolution. I think this goes back to Bernstein. That Bernstein is that sort of idea that a revolution is neither possible nor desirable. And so couldn't Marcuse's One-Dimensional Man be as much about the left and the history of the left and call us to question that deeper history as it might be about the specifics of the capitalist state?
Those are vast questions. I'm not sure I understood the part about nature. In Marcuse, there is a discussion of the new man, which was a concept that I think comes from Che Guevara. The new man as the people who would have to inhabit a socialist society could not be the same kind of people who inhabit a capitalist society. There would be some fundamental change in people's desires and needs that would make them compatible with a society based on cooperation rather than competition, and public goods rather than private consumption, and so on. This is different from the notion of nature that I discussed, which is the nature as, on the one hand, the scientific nature, which is a refined version of some everyday life feeling about nature, which is measurable now and quantified and so on, versus what Marcuse called the wider sense of nature, which is nature as it is experienced. And this nature as it is experienced includes many things that are eliminated from the scientific concept of nature, such as potentialities. So the idea of somehow combining them in a new kind of natural science, which Marcuse proposes as something that could happen in the distant socialist future, doesn't really, to me, doesn't work. But the concept of translation, which he also develops, gives you some way of moving between the wider sense of nature and the narrower scientific sense. The second thing you talked about was
the appearance that revolution is possible, and how that is also about potentially the student movements and questions of the Communist Party.
Yeah, I don't think Marcuse ever gave up the notion that the transition between capitalism and socialism would involve vast social movements. It was not something that you could do through an election. So those movements might be very different from, say, the French Revolution. He thought that the May events of 1968 in France gave you at least a hint of what such a movement would be like. A complete breakdown of social order, refusal of work, rejection of administrative roles by people in government and business. You could imagine a generalized kind of breakdown of people just having had enough and they don't want it anymore. They want to reconfigure their society in some new way. But he did not, I mean, he saw in the May events where he was there for, I was there with him in 1968. He saw there something that was hopeful, and that showed up in some of his writings in the late 60s. But he didn't think that this was going to happen right away. I mean, he didn't have illusions about the near-term prospects.
Hi, Dr. Feenberg. I'm going to try to keep this real quick. It seems to me that in the 1844 economic and philosophical manuscripts, Marx makes it pretty clear that it is actually only in and through social production that man can be meaningfully said to have a species being. How does that square with this notion of there being a life world beyond technology? Is it not the case that it's only in and through technology that we can even speak of something like a human existence, through the objectification of that experience? Thank you.
Yeah, no, the technology is part of the life world. It's not something separate from the life world. We have a relationship to technology which is complex and involves values and cultural dimension. At the same time, the technology modern technology can be constructed in purely technical terms, as though it had an existence entirely outside of humanity. But that's a sort of a useful illusion. That's what makes it possible to have a technical discipline, right? So automotive engineering is really useful. We are happy that it exists. That's why our cars don't always collapse and break down. But it's only a small segment of what a car represents for us. Because in the life world, a car has all sorts of connotations, meanings, right, that go well beyond what you could put in a manual of automotive engineering. So, for example, automobiles have an ecological significance for us today. We think about them in terms of problems of pollution and problems of climate change. In the automotive engineering manual, all you see is something about catalytic converters, or electric. I mean, it's all scientific stuff. It doesn't speak directly at all to our concern about the environment, but our concern is there translated in those features of the automobile. So I don't think that we're here really changing the tune from Marx's notion of objectification. It's just that we now have something he didn't have much understanding of, which is the very elaborate, complex technical disciplines that organize everything today, which he didn't have much. In 1844, he didn't have much insight into. But what he meant by objectification is something like what Marcuse would have meant by the role of the human being and technology in the life world.
Thank you very much, Professor Feenberg, for this. I wonder if your part didn't actually prove Adorno correct when you said that Adorno's critique of the student movement in the 60s was partly, if not mostly, that in the critique and their opposition to the technocratization of the universities, they were actually going to accelerate the technocratization of the university. And what you describe as, great and utopian transformations, like, for instance, the way the AIDS crisis, AIDS activism has transformed medicine, that has produced the neoliberal university in which we live now, which is funded through stakeholder interest and so on. And it has indeed, like ACT UP New York has accelerated the technocratization of the production of science. And so I wonder if that's not exactly what Adorno was describing and exactly his critique of the student movement in the 60s.
Yeah, but you could have made the same critique of workers' demands for a shorter workday and end to child labor. After all, what happened when you got rid of child labor? It didn't create the revolution. It made work much more efficient in the factories, and the kids became, little robots because you got them in school, and you could. So, this is what Marcuse meant by that last quote that I said about ambivalence, the ambivalence of every social movement under capitalism. Of course, the system will survive our efforts to change it. But that's not a reason to give up or to, as Adorno seems to have done, and to denigrate the movements that make the change. That just means you need another movement, right? So it's a process. It's not a single thing.
Okay, just one more question and then we'll kind of back to Ethan to wrap up.
My question is about your usage of the concept of normativity arising from your reading of Marcuse.
What concept?
What concept?
Normativity. Already in Kant, or is beauty normative, firstly? Already in Kant, he says that in the third critique, that aesthetic judgment proceeds from treating the particular as universal. As such, it is rational. We evaluate art as purposive. More broadly, regarding normativity, is socialism normative? After all, can we not imagine potentiality as a factual recognition coming from the place of consciousness becoming to freedom, of seeing that capitalism contains the potentiality for socialism, and as such, is it not capitalism which is normative, as it holds that its progress is rational and positive, that we can reform its contradictions away, and as a result, social movements act positively within capital?
I'm not quite sure I understand. It's certainly the case that capitalism has a unique feature which no earlier social formation had. And that feature is that it makes it clear that the social world is a human creation. It's not God-given. It's not natural. It's a human creation, and so it can be changed. And once people have this idea, then they are in a position, in the 17th century, French peasants revolted in the name of the king. They thought the problem was the tax guy. The king was great, but in other words, they could not imagine a different social world, just a better tax man. Whereas in the capitalist system, it becomes possible for people generally to see that society is a human product and that it can be fundamentally altered. And to that extent, you could say that capitalism has a positive character, a positive normative character. It is an advance over earlier social formations. But it's only an advance, it's not the last stage. Because, according to Marx anyway, there's still a further advance that needs to be made. And Marcuse, of course, as a Marxist, agreed. And that further advance would be the move from a society based on commodities and competition to one based on needs and cooperation.
Okay, several points of order. First of all, can we offer Professor Feenberg a round of applause?